All right, I want to say hello to everybody who's joining us today. You are currently attending. Let me just mute you guys. The MindCORE seminar series, and we are excited to be introducing new MindCORE faculty, new Penn faculty this week and next. I just want to talk about a few little housekeeping things that have already been posted here that you can read. But if you have a question during the presentation that's kind of a general question, or if you are familiar with some of Professor Staley Lydon's work, you are welcome to, you'd like to post a link to an article or something, you can post that right in the chat. If you have a serious question that you'd like to be asked, or a non-serious question, I guess, of our speaker, you can put it in the Ask a Question box to the left here, and you have an opportunity to look at the questions that have already been asked, and you can upvote them. I'm sorry, I think I'm a little nervous today. I feel like I'm messing things up. I think I got your name wrong, David. I'm sorry about that. I reversed your last names. Sorry, I guess I have a little bit of cold feet after being on screen. So hello, everybody there. I'm sorry I have cold feet. I'm going to get out of here so I don't have to do this anymore. And I'm going to do that by introducing our introducer, Professor Ted Satterthwaite.
Hey guys. I think I can talk without echo now. Hey guys, great to see you. Thanks for everyone for joining us. We got a really good turnout for a great speaker today. I'm super excited to introduce just an absolute rising star who just joined the faculty and tell you about his a little bit about his awesome work. So let me introduce David Lydon-Staley. David is from Ireland, hence the charming accent you'll have the pleasure of hearing for the next hour. He was educated at Trinity College Dublin and then did his graduate work at Penn State University before coming to be a postdoc with the superstar we all know and love, Danny Bassett. What's really incredible about David's work is that he goes beyond kind of a standard network science approach by thinking not just of brains as networks, but behaviors as networks too. Furthermore, unlike thinking of networks as something that's static, he tries to understand how brains and behavior evolve over time through dynamic measures, which is really just cutting edge of the field and helping people understand everything from brain development to brain networks to alcohol and drug use. And today, I'm really excited for you guys to hear his talk. When questions come up, feel free to type them into the Ask a Question box. Also, you can put something in the chat, but it'll be easier to keep tab if you put it in the Ask a Question box. So without further ado, you turn it over to Professor Lydon-Staley, and please give him a warm welcome.
Great. Thanks so much for the introduction. And so, yeah, we're going to jump right in. I'll be talking about intensively sampling daily life, why I do it and why I think it's important. But before I do, I just want to acknowledge a lot of the collaborators on this work. As we know, science is a team sport. And so these are just some of the people who have been really generous with their time and their data and their ideas throughout the years. And of course, acknowledging the funders too. So I wanted to start with a quote from one of my favorite plays. In Sunday in the Park with George, Stephen Sondheim explores the life and work of Georges Seurat, the famous French pointillist painter, and especially this painting, a Sunday on the afternoon on the island of La Grande Jatte. And when you kind of zoom back and look at this painting, it's this beautiful, seamless masterpiece. But then when you zoom in into a part of the painting, which we see up on this top left, you can see every individual moment where Seurat dabbed the canvas with his paintbrush. And in the play, Seurat says, bit by bit, putting it together, piece by piece, only way to make a work of art. Every moment makes a contribution. Every little detail plays a part. And putting it together, that's what counts. And when I think about this play, and in particular this passage, I think about the big ideas in developmental science that guide my work. So I'm a developmental scientist by training, and in developmental science, we often care a lot about intra-individual change. So this is change happening over relatively long time scales. So here we have like age in years or decades. And this type of change is thought to be like an enduring change, construed as developmental, occurring over very long time scales. But against this backdrop of intra-individual change, we have what we call intra-individual variability. And so these are fluctuations in behavior that are construed as relatively more reversible than the developmental changes we see on longer timescales. And I care a lot about these second to second, minute to minute, day to day fluctuations for lots of reasons. But first, I just want to show you what kind of fluctuations I'm talking about. So here, for example, you have one individual who's reporting on their negative mood twice a day for 28 days. So here are the occasions, and it's going from low to high negative mood. And we could do a couple of things with these data. We could just take their average value and say, okay, you have pretty low negative mood. It's about 33. But I think there's a richness to these data, especially in the extent to which this person's negative mood is fluctuating above and below their means. And this is the kind of domain of fluctuation that I care a lot about. And two of the reasons I care about these fluctuations comes from, one, this idea from developmental science that behavior is the leading edge of adaptation. So when we think about behavior, we often think about it as an outcome, something to be explained by our biology, our environment, as well as the interaction between our biology and environment. But behavior is more than just an outcome. Behavior, in a very real way, impacts our biology and our environment, such that the minor moments of every day, so the little behaviors we're doing every day, build on each other. They accumulate over time to make us who we are. So that's a pretty big idea, but I'll go into how we're looking at fluctuations in order to realize this idea. The second main reason I care a lot about these fluctuations stems from my interest in how discrete domains of functioning come together to form something that's greater than the sum of its parts. So just as in Seurat's painting, all of the little pieces come together to form something greater than the sum of its parts, so something, this like masterpiece. It's a truism in developmental science that behavior or anything you're studying is multi-determined. So much goes into any individual behavior that we're studying. And so when I approach things like substance use, depression, and curiosity, which are kind of three main things that I care a lot about, I look to see how the family context is changing from moment to moment, affective function is changing, your sleep is changing, the daily hassles that you're encountering in your everyday life, how you're seeking out and being exposed to certain types of media, what cognitive processes are doing from moment to moment, and also fluctuations in the organization of large-scale functional brain networks. And so I take a really broad approach because I find it really easy to get interested in something, but also because I take seriously the idea from developmental science that humans are complex, dynamic systems with feelings, thoughts, and actions that are interconnected and that change over time. And so I'm going to talk about how I've been taking these different bits, these different domains of functioning, and putting them together in order to realize this idea of humans as complex systems. And to do that, we're going to couple these fluctuations, this intra-individual variability with network science. Okay, so that's like the big picture. That's why I care about zooming into day-to-day life. And we're going to go through three different applications of this. So we're going to look at first, emotion networks and depression. So just to give you a little bit of background on emotion dynamics, emotions are functional. They motivate and they organize us to respond to important stimuli and situations. Even negative emotions like sadness, while they don't feel great, doesn't feel good when you're feeling sad, it's useful. It tells you that there's a discrepancy between where you are right now and where you want to be. And this can often motivate us to change. But we're not slaves to our emotions, and our emotions can and often should be modulated. And this often involves a change in the duration of our emotional experiences. So in healthy functioning, we find that emotions persist until our goals are achieved. So they do help us achieve our goals. But if our goals change, if something in the environment changes, we also see that our emotions are reactive to that. They rise and fall when appropriate. In contrast to this flexible emotion system in kind of healthy functioning, when we look at depression and other forms of psychopathology, rather than seeing this flexibility in emotions, we often see what we term emotion rigidity. And that's usually expressed as a contextually inappropriate persistence in emotions. So again, going back to this idea that it has something to do with the duration of an emotion time series. The way we get at this is by doing experience sampling. So we send people out into the world with their own phones, and we ask them multiple times a day about how they're doing. So what do their emotions look like right now? And by doing this, we get lots of data on the same person. So we get their fluctuations in their emotions and their mood from moment to moment and day to day for many, many days. But we also get pretty high ecological validity. So we also do some work in the laboratory, but with that work, it tells you what can happen. So if you put an individual in a certain situation, what can happen? But by looking at people as they go about their daily lives, we get more insight into what actually does happen. Okay, so when we get this data from individuals, it looks something like this. So imagine this is an emotion measure of some sort, and it's fluctuating over time. In healthy functioning, it looks something like this, where the fluctuations are pretty random, going up and down without any kind of clear pattern. And if you were to if you were trying to predict what was happening to this emotion time series at the next time point based on where you are right now, you'd have a pretty hard time. And this is thought to kind of indicate that there's flexibility in the system. It's changing in response to the environment. In contrast, in depression and in other forms of psychopathology, you would see something more like this, where the emotion is changing very slowly. And so this is kind of where the idea of rigidity comes from. And another way to think about that is that if you were to try and predict what kind of level of emotion would come next based on where you are right now, you'd have a pretty easy time, actually. Okay, so as well as changing across time, our emotions also change across states. Gross and Munoz give the example of becoming anxious after having an angry outburst. And we can represent this change in emotions across time and also across states within a network perspective. So in these emotion networks, the discrete units or the nodes are individual emotions. So here we have happiness, anger, anxiety, and depression. And then the edges or the lines that are going in between the different emotions tell us how predictable an emotion is by another emotion at the previous time point. So here it's saying, if I'm angry right now, this is predicting my happiness at the next time point. You will also see that there are arrows between all these emotions, but some of them are stronger or thicker arrows than others. And this is just indicating that the strength of prediction is greater. So for example, anxiety is a better predictor of anger at the next time point than anger is right now of anxiety at the next time point. This becomes a little easier to see when we look at two individuals. So you can see that the network on the right has much stronger edges, indicating that this is a more predictive emotion system from one time point to the next. These strong temporal connections are thought to encourage the spread of emotion to other emotions across time. And in extreme cases, it's thought to lead to emotion systems that are responding to themselves rather than rising and falling flexibly as conditions demand. And so it's thought that this would place people at risk for depression, or might be an indication of what's happening in depression. So this is a very rich theory behind these emotion networks and dynamics, but now we're going to see how we would actually operationalize this. So these are data from Gregory Fosco at Penn State, and he has over 150 adolescents recruited through Pennsylvania. And at baseline, they completed the revised child anxiety and depression scale, so we have a sense of their trait depression. But then every day for 21 days, these adolescents reported on their mood. So now we have a time series of mood going across 21 days. And so this is what that looks like. Here you're just looking at their reports of the depressed mood going from low to high across days 1 to 21. Every line here is a participant. It looks like a bowl of spaghetti, but I just wanted you to get a sense of what these fluctuations look like. And the takeaway here is that there are lots of fluctuations and that there are lots of between-person differences in these fluctuations. So we have these data for each person, for depressed mood, for anger, for happiness, and for anxiety. And we want to make some emotion networks out of these. So how do we do that? So to do this, we do it in a piecemeal fashion where we take one emotion at a time. Here we're just looking at anxiety as the outcome variable. And so it's anxiety at the current time point, so at time t, and we want to see how well it's being predicted by happiness, depression, anxiety, and anger at the previous time points. That's why you have t-1. And so now we have an estimate of how well the other emotions, including anxiety at the previous time point, are predicting anxiety right now. And so we have the four kind of edges of this network. We repeat this process with depression as the outcome variable, happiness as the outcome variable, anger as the outcome variable, and we end up with, for each person, all of these 16 edges, indicating the interplay between different emotions across time. We can simply take the sum of the absolute value of these 16 slopes to get a sense of how predictive the system is as a whole for each individual. And again, the idea here is that denser networks, so networks that have this higher network density score, will be more self-predicted. responding to themselves rather than flexibly responding to changing situations. And so this GIF is just cycling through all the networks in the sample, going from the lowest network density score to the highest network density score. So as the GIF cycles, you'll start to see the edges getting thicker and darker, indicating stronger temporal associations between emotions across time. It took me like 30 minutes to make this GIF a couple of years ago, so I like to leave it on the screen for a little bit to get the most out of it. All right. And so the idea is that people who have these higher, denser networks are going to have greater depressive symptoms. And when we predict number of depressive symptoms with emotion network density, that's what we find. And this is controlling for age, sex, and then a baseline difficulties in emotion regulation scale. I wanted to see if this kind of complex index was giving us something above and beyond what we would get if we just asked people about their difficulties in emotion regulation. And so it turns out that it does. When we also break down our group into a depressed and a non-depressed group based on clinical cutoffs, we also find that emotion network density is higher in the depressed group. Okay, so when we examine the bits, so these discrete emotions, and start putting them together by examining the crosstalk between emotions across time, we begin to model emotion dynamics in a way that lines up with how we think the emotional lives are happening in daily life. So we get at this crosstalk, we get at this moment-to-moment transfer of emotions. We also might be finding a marker of inefficient emotion regulation that places people at risk for depression. And while we can kind of summarize this using a network density term, the theory is a lot richer than the kind of summary statistic that we got. There's this like really rich theory and an image of this idea of emotion activity reverberating through the network. So in this next project, we're going to go after this kind of reverberation to see if we can get a better match to between our methods and our theory. So we're going to do that in the context of a network approach to tobacco withdrawal that takes these ideas from the emotion networks world and brings them to tobacco. So just a little background on tobacco and smoking. So quitting smoking is really difficult. So here you're looking at the percent of smokers who made quit attempts in the past year across a couple of different age bins. So, you have up to 66 and, 48% or so saying that they've made quit attempts in the previous year. And down here, you're looking at the smokers who successfully quit in the past year. And so it's much smaller percentages, going from about 5 to 9%. So quitting smoking is really hard. One thing that makes quitting smoking difficult is that when we stop smoking, withdrawal symptoms appear. Things like anger, anxiety, difficulty concentrating, increases in craving, for example, that cause us to go back to smoking, because once we reuptake smoking, these withdrawal symptoms go away. So you have some negative reinforcement processes going on. There are interventions out there to target withdrawal symptoms, but even the majority of even the most intensive intervention-guided cessation attempts still end in relapse. So this is a really hard problem, and I've been turning to network approaches to see if we can get a handle on it. So from the kind of traditional perspectives on tobacco withdrawal, if a patient comes into the clinic and they endorse 4 or more of these withdrawal symptoms, they're considered to have tobacco withdrawal. So if someone comes in and they endorse experiencing anger, anxiety, depressed mood, and restlessness, they're considered to have tobacco withdrawal. If a second person comes in and they endorse having anger, difficulty concentrating, increased appetite, and insomnia, they would also be classed as having tobacco withdrawal. And the reason that we could have these very two different profiles of withdrawal symptoms kind of still being considered tobacco withdrawal is that from the traditional perspective, we're not really interested in the symptoms. The symptoms are interchangeable. They're merely indicators for this underlying latent idea of tobacco withdrawal. We can't see it, so we use symptoms to try and get at it. And if you would typically draw this kind of latent diagram like this, where you have this idea of tobacco withdrawal, and it's indicated by the symptoms, which is why the arrows are all going from tobacco withdrawal to the symptoms. And the symptoms are viewed as passive indicators of an underlying disease. And so this is interesting. This has been useful, and it helps us understand tobacco withdrawal, but it is missing a couple of things. And the kind of main thing is the idea that these symptoms can actually be active. They're not simply passive indicators. So for example, we might want to put arrows between the different symptoms. So if you are experiencing increases in insomnia, it's likely that you're also going to experience increases in difficulty concentrating. So the insomnia would cause difficulty concentrating. Difficulty concentrating may make you feel depressed, and we've already just seen all the potential interplay between these different emotions across time in the previous emotion network density example. So this is a traditional perspective, and then in the network perspective, it captures all of these potential causal interactions between symptoms by taking a stance that says that mental disorders may be best characterized not in terms of this latent idea indicated by passive symptoms. Instead, it would be best characterized in terms of the causal interaction between different components in a symptom network. So the symptoms here are causally interacting with one another. And so this is a theory that allows us to kind of focus on symptom interplay across time, to capture something we think is important, but it also has implications for how we think about the development and the maintenance and treatment of disorders. So from this network perspective, this is how a mental disorder would develop. We start off with a dormant symptom network. So here you have these 4 nodes, and they're connected by some edges. And what this kind of dormant symptom network tells us is that if a symptom was activated, how would it causally influence the activation of other symptoms? And so when a symptom perturbation happens from somewhere outside of the network, so for example, a decrease in nicotine or exposure to a smoking cue for someone who's trying to quit cigarette smoking, this would activate symptoms. But the activation doesn't stop just at the symptoms activated by the perturbation. Instead, because symptoms interact with one another, symptom activity spreads to other symptoms via causal interactions. So for example, insomnia causes increases in difficulty concentrating, such that when symptom perturbation ends, activity is still kind of sustained in this network, and symptoms remain active. We end up with a self-perpetuating symptom network representing a state of psychopathology long after the initial event that activated the symptoms it's gone. So it's similar to this idea in the emotion networks, where now we have a system that's responding to itself rather than anything that's happening outside. Crucially, there are between-person differences in how we think these disorders will develop based on their dormant symptom network structure. So we just saw the vulnerable network that kind of facilitates the spread of activity through the network. In a resilient network, the dormant network would have a structure that doesn't necessarily facilitate the spread. So you would have symptom perturbation, symptoms would activate, but you don't see a lot of spreading in the symptoms, because you'll notice that they don't have as many edges in this network relative to this one. And also the edges that are there are weaker, so they have a thinner line. So the structure doesn't support the spread of symptom activity to other symptoms. And when symptom perturbation ends, eventually the symptoms deactivate. Okay, so this is a really nice, rich kind of theoretical idea about reverberation. We want to see if we can operationalize that. So to do this, we have data from Megan Piper, and it's 290 daily smokers. They, for 4 times a day for 2 weeks, they reported on different withdrawal symptoms coming from the Wisconsin Smoking Withdrawal Scale. Some of them they're all trying to quit. So during this 2 weeks, they're not smoking as best as they can. And then some of them are in a combination treatment where they're getting nicotine patch and nicotine lozenge. So it's a combination, it's 2 things. And then there's a placebo group that we're going to compare that group to. So for each person, again, just like in the emotion network density case, we now have a time series of how, in this case, their symptoms are changing from moment to moment. And we want to estimate how strongly each symptom at the current time point predicts symptoms at the next time point. And when we do it, we get a kind of similar picture to what we find in the emotion network density work. Here you can see that there's substantial moment-to-moment interplay among withdrawal symptoms. This is at the group level. So for the kind of average person in the sample, this is what it looks like. But to go after these between differences in the persistence of symptom activity across time, we can move to the individual level, create networks for each individual, and ask how activity might reverberate through that system. So here you're looking at a symptom network for one person. So again, the nodes are individual withdrawal symptoms, anxiety, irritability, sadness, etc. And the edges are telling us how well they predict other symptoms at the next time point. You'll notice that we now have red edges. Before it was just green, indicating positive associations. So if if my sadness is increased now, my irritability is increased later. For this individual, they also have red edges. So for example, that would be if I'm hungry right now, I'm less likely to be hungry at the next time point. So they've eaten a sandwich or something. But you can just get a sense of the heterogeneity of what individual networks might look like, and they might not look like the group model at all. Okay, so we have this network structure for each person. And rather than doing something like take the density or the strength of the edges we're going to use something called impulse response analysis to try and get a match to this nice idea of activity reverberating through the system. So with impulse response analysis, you take this as the underlying structure, you simulate an increase in a symptom, and then you examine how long it takes for the symptom activity to return stably to equilibrium, so to go back to zero. So to make that more concrete, we're going to simulate an increase in anxiety. We're going to watch to see what happens with sadness, and that is represented over here. So when you simulate an increase in anxiety, nothing happens to sadness because there are no arrows going from anxiety to sadness, either directly or indirectly. In contrast, if we were to simulate an increase in sadness and look to see what was happening to anxiety, we can see that anxiety increases and then eventually goes back to zero after seven or so time points. And this is because there are direct associations between sadness and anxiety, but also indirect ones that go through irritability, then craving, and then to anxiety. So this impulse response analysis kind of gets at the spreading of activity from through the network, both directly and indirectly. So we can repeat this for every symptom. We can ping every symptom and watch all the other symptoms to see how long it takes for activity to go to baseline. And then we can summarize. This is a 6x6 matrix. I'm just showing you 3 so that you can kind of see the numbers. But in reality, it would have all of the symptoms. And we can just take the average of all these recovery times. And we end up with a network recovery time statistic that tells us on average how long does it take for nodes to recover when they're perturbed by themselves or other nodes. And when we compare this system recovery time on the y-axis here across the different treatment conditions, we see that participants receiving combination treatment show shorter system recovery time relative to placebo matched groups. So people who are receiving treatment have network structures that don't facilitate the spread of symptom activity to other symptoms as much as those who are not receiving the treatment. So this could be one mechanism through which treatment is making the withdrawal experience less aversive. I want to highlight that this is proof of concept work. The data were not collected in a way that it wasn't collected in order to make individual level networks. And so what we really want is similar data, but with lots and lots and lots and more data per individual. And so that's what we're doing right now. This is work funded by NIDA. And the day-to-day research work is being done by the lab's research coordinator, Asia Vincent, who's doing a fantastic job. And what she is doing is she is recruiting smokers into our study. They're daily smokers. And 10 times a day for 10 days, they're reporting on withdrawal symptoms while they smoke as usual. And then they're doing this again during a cessation attempt. So in each of these periods, we end up with up to 100 time points per individual of their withdrawal symptoms across time. So we can be a bit more confident in the accuracy of the individual networks that we're constructing. And so this will help us see if we can replicate this idea that self-perpetuating networks will make cessation more difficult. Okay. So in this context, when we examine the bits, so the individual symptoms, and start putting them together, and here we have the crosstalk between symptoms across time, we can capture symptom activity spread. We can get a closer match between this idea of reverberation and the methods that we use. And we see some indication that treatment might be decreasing symptom activity spread. It might be one way through which cessation efforts can help people quit. Okay. So both those kind of approaches focused on fluctuations. I'm going to now talk about something completely different, but still looking at the importance of capturing intensively sampling everyday behaviors. So here we're looking at curiosity as a knowledge network building practice, and we're going to go after individual differences in knowledge accumulation. So again, this idea that I talked about at the beginning, that our everyday behaviors are important, they accumulate over time, and essentially make us who we are. So just a little background on curiosity. It's defined in lots of different ways through the literature. Here, when I talk about curiosity, I mean the propensity to seek out novel, complex, and challenging interactions with the world. People who are high on trait curiosity tend also to be high on life satisfaction and well-being. And this association between curiosity and well-being is often interpreted through the lens of Barbara Fredrickson's broaden and build theory. So when people are in states of curiosity, they states of curiosity produce novel and broad-ranging thoughts and actions that build into resources. So when we're curious, we do things that we wouldn't normally do, and we get skills from doing this. And that feeds back into our well-being. But this idea of resources is pretty black boxy. We don't know what curious practice actually looks like and what exactly the type of resources that are collected when practicing curiosity are. And part of the reason why it's so difficult to get at this is because the information seeking that comes with curiosity is very open-ended, it's super idiosyncratic, so lots of between-person differences. And so that's what we're going after here. We're going to see if we can capture curious practice. To do this, we working with collaborator Dr. Perry Zern. He's an assistant professor at American University. He took a historical-philosophical method to identify curious practices that have been talked about in the Western canon for millennia. And so he looks for terms for curiosity across different languages to identify curious practices. And when he does this, he identifies 3 different styles, 2 of which I'll talk about today. The first is the style of the busybody. And so we see this in Plutarch, who says, the busybody, shunning the country as something stale and uninteresting and undramatic, pushes into the bazaar and the marketplace and the harbor is asking, is there any news? It doesn't matter what the news is. You get this idea, this kind of image of the individual flitting about between novel information, pieces of information. We see this also in the work of Martin Heidegger, who characterizes the busybody as never dwelling anywhere, that it's a practice characterized by distraction. In contrast to this person who's going after very different ideas, you have the style of the hunter. And again, we have Plutarch saying, if you have to be curious, so he's placing some judgment on the curiosity of the busybody. I don't, and you can probably see that since I'm studying 100 different things. But he places some judgment on the busybody style of curiosity and says, if you have to be curious, don't turn aside and follow every scent, but keep your sense of smell pure and untainted for its proper task. Go after one idea and fill in the whole picture, essentially. Nietzsche says something similar, saying that the man of curiosity wishes he had a few hundred helpers and good, well-trained hounds that he could drive into the history of the human soul to round up his game. So again, this targeted information search. So now we have our 2 styles, and we're going to see if we can operationalize these. We're going to do this within a knowledge network building framework. We think it's one way that we can get a leverage our data to get insight into these styles. And so in this framework, we represent knowledge as networks where the individual nodes are distinct concepts, and then an edge is between nodes to indicate that these are relatively similar concepts. And we'll talk about how we quantify that in a minute. But for now, I just want you to focus on the differences between this person's network and this person's network. I want you to imagine that these are 2 individuals who practice their curiosity. They go on an information-seeking expedition, and when they come back, we find out that they have visited the same number of concepts. So they have the same number of nodes in their networks. But this person's network has very few edges between the concepts. So they've sampled very diverse concepts, and they've created a relatively loose network. In contrast, and in line more with the style of the hunter, same number of nodes, but this person has many more edges in their network, indicating that there's a lot of similarity between the concepts that they visited. So they've sampled closely connected concepts, and they create tight networks. So I've talked very generally about loose and tight and similarity between concepts. And now we're going to operationalize that as an instance of knowledge network building. So to do this, we recruited participants from Philadelphia. Here's the gender, age, and race ethnicity breakdown of the sample if you're interested. They completed a baseline survey where we collected demographic information and also personality surveys, including trait curiosity surveys. They then completed 21 days of daily diaries. And as well as daily diaries, they completed 15 minutes per day of a knowledge network building task. And so by doing this for 21 days, for 15 minutes each day, we end up with over 5 hours of information-seeking behavior from all of our participants. To give you some more insight into what that task looked like, we simply asked them to go onto Wikipedia and to spend 15 minutes reading about whatever they felt like on Wikipedia. We wanted to keep it open-ended, given that curiosity tends to be defined as intrinsically motivated information seeking. So participants would go onto Wikipedia, they could click on links to get to new pages, but they didn't have to just rely on links. They could search for new topics up in the search bar, for example. And again, everyone did this for 21 days for 15 minutes each day. So we have lots of data on each individual. The data we get from this is the Wikipedia pages that they visited and the order in which they visited them. So that's the data that we're going to take forward. So the sample as a whole visited over 18,000 unique Wikipedia pages. And to turn these into networks, we have the individual pages as nodes. So the individual nodes are going after discrete concepts. Here you have the Wikipedia page for dog, and here's one for Philadelphia. But now we need to put these bits together. Now we need to figure out how to create an edge to indicate the similarity between these two concepts. And the way we do that is by taking the cosine similarity of the term frequency, inverse document frequency across all of these 18,000 plus pages. And that's a long way of saying that it's essentially a measure of how similar the text is between all pairs of pages. If a page is identical, it will have a value of 1. If it is there's no similarity, it will have a value of 0. So it's going from 0 to 1 with stronger values indicating greater similarity. So now for each person, we have the pages they visited and the order in which they visited them. So for example, imagine someone visited Marie Curie, Pierre Curie, China, and Beijing, and it was in that order. Now we also have a weight associated with this edge that tells us just how much of a conceptual leap it was. So this is a high similarity value. It's not a very big conceptual leap to go from Marie Curie to Pierre Curie, but it's a much bigger conceptual leap, and so a smaller similarity value to go from Pierre Curie to China. And so one simple thing we can do is simply take the average edge weight for each person's Wikipedia travels in the data set, and we can make an average edge weight distribution for everyone in the sample. So here's your average edge weight on the x-axis, and people over on this side with the low average edge weight are making big conceptual leaps as they move from page to page. So they are doing what we think the busybody is doing. And people on the right-hand side of the distribution who have the relatively larger average edge weights are making smaller conceptual leaps. So they're visiting more similar pages as they move from page to page. So does this work? We've quantified something, but is it actually useful? We can take someone from this side who should look like the busybody and see if that's the case. So this is just a sample of an individual's travels through Wikipedia. So they started visiting physical chemistry. They then went to the Me Too movement. They then went to the Partridge Family. Then they read about Harvard Primary School, which is a school in England. Then they read about HIP 79431, which I learned from doing the study is a star. And then they also read about Tom Bigelow, who's a race car driver. This is just a section of their travels, but you can see that it's a pretty diverse, seemingly random collection of concepts, as we would hope to expect, given the average edge weight. We can also look at someone over here. They have higher than average edge weight. They should look more like the hunter, making small conceptual leaps as they move from page to page. And that is indeed what we find. So this person read about the history of Jews in Germany. They then read about the Hep riots. So it's an incident in Jewish history. They then read about Zionism and then also some other Jewish thinkers. And so again, you have this thread of closely connected concepts. You might be curious about this person over here, and I am so glad that this person is in the sample because it's a really nice proof of concept, I think. So this person has, a really outlying value for average edge weight and should show that they're going after very similar topics. And so this person is a super hunter. We can call them that. Why not? And almost every single page they visited had something to do with the British royal family. So they visited Elizabeth II, George VI, Edward VIII, George V, and the only page that wasn't about an individual member of the British royal family was about a boat named after Queen Elizabeth II. So this was a really nice kind of proof of concept. There's face validity to what we're finding. We can capture these notions of busybody, hunter, tight, loose styles out of this complex 5 hours worth of information seeking. Okay, but are we measuring curiosity as other people think about curiosity? We can answer this by looking at whether average edge weight is associated with existing measures of curiosity that we have at baseline. And so we look to see if average edge weight is associated with deprivation sensitivity. So if you're someone who's high in trait deprivation sensitivity, you seek information to escape the tension of not knowing something, so you don't like having all of the answers. You have a determination to continue information seeking until a knowledge gap is filled. And information seeking that's driven by deprivation sensitivity results in a persistent and effortful form of specific exploration. So it's going after specific content to resolve an unknown. And as you would expect, greater deprivation sensitivity is associated with greater average edge weight. So they look more like the kind of hunter style of information seeking. And this is controlling for a whole host of other things that I'm happy to talk about. Okay, so we can operationalize curious practice as knowledge network building. We can also characterize types of network structure using graph theory. Here, I just talked about average edge weight, but you can also look at things like clustering and path length, and they also all show meaningful associations with deprivation sensitivity. And so by doing this, we can start to open up the black box of resources collected during curious practice in order to detail the link between curious practice and well-being. So I'm super excited about this line of research, and in current directions, I'm moving away from just looking at just Wikipedia and trying to get more naturalistic browsing. So this isn't from a participant, this is from my friend Roshan Nireen. She said I could share this as long as I tagged her, so follow her and make her happy. But here I just asked her to do some screen recording for 10 minutes of downtime in the evening. And so this is sped up, which is why it's going so fast. But even just from this, you can see that no one's spending 15 minutes on Wikipedia every day for 21 days, right? She's shifting in and out of different platforms. So she was on Twitter for a minute, then she was on Instagram. Now she's looking at Google Maps. And so I have this kind of stuff in mind when I'm thinking about where to bring this research next. And one of the great things about being in Annenberg is that I have colleagues who have been thinking about this stuff for a long time. So when we focus on curiosity on Wikipedia, we might come to the premature conclusion that people are captains of their own new media curiosity ships. They can just go wherever they feel like and indulge their curiosity. But Wikipedia is a very weird place on the internet. It features exclusively free content. There's no commercial advertisements. It's primarily funded through donations, whereas the contemporary digital landscape emphasizes continual self-disclosure, reduced user agency, and increased level of surveillance. And so another colleague at Annenberg, Joseph Thoreau, I'll read the highlighted bits. It's just a really good passage, so I pasted the whole thing here. He kind of highlights this idea that every day, most if not all Americans who use the internet are being quietly peeked at, poked, analyzed, and tagged as they move through the online world. And this is happening because companies are trying to activate individuals' buying impulses. So they want to sell us more stuff. But it has broader and social and cultural consequences. It customizes our media content on the basis of marketing reputations we don't even know we have. So if you were looking closely at Roshin's 10 minutes of browsing on her phone, she was being advertised to by alcohol companies. I think that's a stereotype because she's Irish, that they're going after her for alcohol. But you get a sense of how there's these reputations that you have online that you don't necessarily know you have, that customizes the media content that you're being exposed to. And so there are these computer-generated conclusions about who we are, which is affecting the media content, the streams of commercial messages, the discount offers, information, news, and entertainment that we're confronted with every day. So moving away from this idea of captains of new media curiosity ships, we're going to be using these naturalistic screen recording paradigms to get at where is curiosity being directed and how is that happening? And how are the information resources that people collect while building their knowledge networks? So when they're using their downtime to read about things that make you who you are, it's the times when you get the content that you bring up in conversations with other people. So how is this being shaped by our personalized online environments? Okay, so that was a lot, but hopefully it gives you a sense of why I care about daily and momentary experiences. Coupling inter-individual variability with network science to model humans as complex systems. I think they're giving us insight into state and system properties that maintain emotion and symptom intensity, and that help us quantify the accumulation of content that makes us who we are. And thanks.
David, thank you so much for that awesome talk. Everyone give David a virtual round of applause from their homes. Awesome stuff. What really comes through in your work, David, is just how interdisciplinary the work is, drawing from many different fields to push forward really important questions. What I'll make a personal comment, which I failed to make at the beginning due to being put off by the echo there, which is that David is one of the most generous and kind collaborators. When you work with him, you kind of have the mental model of, I wish I had him as my graduate school mentor. So that's for all the people who are looking early in their careers at postdocs and for your grad school mentor, definitely think of David. So we have a lot of questions that came up during the talk, but please post more. As they get upvoted, I'll basically read them aloud and David will discuss them. The most upvoted question right now is from the esteemed Professor Joe Cable. In the experience sampling data set, did you have measures of events that occurred that might be driving emotions, such that you could directly pit the influence of current environment versus past emotions on the current emotional state? Yeah, great idea. So for that data set, we had things like, and I have other data sets where we collect things like family cohesion and conflict that day. So we have papers where we examine
the extent to which family cohesion or family conflict is affecting your emotion at that minute, and the extent to which your emotional life persists after that initial event. Like, does it persist for a couple of more days? And typically, you see this especially in the stress reactivity work, that you can characterize people by the amount of time it takes for them to recover from like a stressful event versus other, and this has implications for depression and things like that. In these emotion networks, the reason I didn't kind of pull those into the networks straight away is because of the way that the data are being centered. So you're kind of getting at within-person fluctuations, which are telling us how relative to your own kind of typical day, like how are you fluctuating up and down. And so there are lots of different inputs that could be leading into those emotion lives, but presumably your environment is not staying constant, right? And that should kind of be captured by centering in the way that we do. And so I guess another thing I should say is that even though we're talking about emotion network density and we're measuring emotion networks, so much more is coming from that signal than just emotion. And this is the same. This is true for everything we study. Whenever we get a self-report, it's like, yes, we're getting what we're asking you directly, but it's also telling us something about the interplay between the person and environment. And so I think there's a lot of complex interactions between the person and the world that are embedded in these simple kind of indices. One other way that we've taken the environment into account, and this is work being led by an amazing, she was a PhD student at Penn State. She's now a postdoc at Stanford University. Her name is Xiao Yang. She has some really great work where she creates similar networks multiple times. So they have it at like 3 time points, a couple of months apart, and also collects background information on life stress. So the kind of big, like, have you had big life events in the past couple of weeks? And she finds that there's no huge association between these kind of dormant network structures and depression until you account for changes that are happening in the environment. So if you have a network structure that would facilitate the spread of activity through symptom networks, it only seems to matter for your depression if you've had a perturbating event, if you've had one of these big life events that would kind of impact your emotion networks. That was a long and rambly answer, but hopefully it give you a sense of what I'm thinking there. If not, please ask a follow-up.
Yeah, excellent. So yeah, and if you have follow-up questions for David, you can put them in the comment box under your question as it's being answered or shortly thereafter. The next question is from Vida. Does consistent triggering of resilient symptom networks strengthen the respective connections, turning to a more vulnerable network over time? Or are there connection strengths between symptoms relatively stable within the same person? Basically, is there something like a plasticity of symptom networks that can be strengthened through use or like fire together for symptom networks? Yeah,
that's a really interesting idea. So for that, we need more of the type of data we're collecting. So hopefully I try to make it clear that we're kind of like in that kind of weird dance between data and method and theory where, as it's more feasible to collect more data, our methods kind of need to catch up, and our theory is already pretty kind of complex and is starting to get more and more aligned with the method stuff. But I would advocate for more of these type of intensive burst designs, I would say, where you can get enough data to create a network in one moment, then do it again in like a couple of months' time, and then a couple of months' time. And people who have done that, so Xiao Yang, I already mentioned, and Neelam Ram, who's also at Stanford, they have done these types of intensive burst designs. And it's only by doing that you can quantify networks at each point and see if there's much consistency or change between them. So it's still early days. There is some change happening, and that change seems to be related to things we care about, like depression over time. In terms of whether you could change like the edge between a symptom, I mean, I think that in many ways is what like some therapies try to do. I think the closest example of work that I've done that kind of went after that was looking at how increases in sadness were leading to increases in uncontrollable rumination. And we found that the link was, partially explained by large-scale networks involved in cognitive control. So people who tended to be able to recruit cognitive control to a greater extent didn't have this like sadness, uncontrollable rumination link. Another example would be the association between increases in stress and depressed mood, which occurs. So if your stress increases, your depressed mood increases, but only on days where you are not curious. And by curious, we measured it as kind of being open to challenges. If it's a day where you have an increase in stress, but you're like open to viewing challenges as something that will kind of grow you or whatever, this stress and depression link goes away. But I think there's lots of stuff that could be done there, and that would be a really interesting like intervention. Like if we could put a group in a mindfulness group, for example, and how to control to see if their connections between states and symptoms would change over time, and reconfigure the network. That's super cool stuff. Would love to talk more.
Excellent. Next question. I think that actually does relate to the question I posted, David, which is how these symptom networks could explain things like comorbidity. Like what's behind the question is like there's a lot of there's a lot of focus in mental health research right now on the P factor. The idea that if you have one mental illness, you're likely to have another, and that much of this can be captured by a latent dimension called the P factor, which is like G for intelligence, like what's your overall vulnerability to psychopathology. And there's been a lot of criticism of that approach. It's been heavily validated in terms of like its stability and across cultures and versus brain, but there's been a lot of criticism because it's just like, well, people are like, well, who cares? It's too non-specific. And as you were talking about these reverberating symptom networks, I was wondering how much those could explain comorbidity and this kind of very large effect you see for the P factor.
Yeah, so that's where the kind of broader network approach to psychopathology framework came from. So it was like noticing that, these symptoms in the latent models you're talking about are all pointing upwards toward this latent idea of a problem that we can't see. And so, for example, with the comorbidity between like depression and anxiety, which comes up all the time, the network perspective partly was introduced to kind of make sense of that, where you have like symptoms of depression, symptoms of anxiety. If you look at the overlap of those symptoms in the DSM, there are similar symptoms across both kind of criteria, and it's plausible in daily life that they're impacting one another. So like, your sleep is going to be impacting even your anxiety, your depressed mood, which could eventually cause those symptoms to kind of stay activated, and then you would show up as having anxiety according to like a diagnostic test. That's how it's being that's kind of one reason that this framework exists. I think they're both useful. Like I hopefully didn't present them as like two alternative cognitive approaches or whatever. Like the P factor approach is really good at knowing like, okay, do you need help? Is there something like wrong? How can we help you type thing? I think the network perspective tries to dig a little bit into a mechanism that might be leading to all of that stuff.
I'm going to take the prerogative of asking your follow-up question then. So do you think that that this sort of approach could kind of get us beyond the diagnostic classifications that lead to things like the P factor in the first place? Because in some ways, one of the biggest problems facing mental health research is, you can have the best engineers and the best multivariate pattern classification and best deep learning, but in the end, if your labels are bad, it's going to be garbage in, garbage out, because it's usually supervised learning, and you have to say, well, this is that, and that's how computer vision and other kind of multivariate learning has advanced. And so is this a way where you could, do you think about this as a mechanism to get us better labels and get better phenotyping that could bootstrap us to better prediction?
So that's a really good question. And the first thing I would say is that to do that, so the network approach adopts a lot of what's already out there that's problematic. So if you'll notice in the networks on tobacco withdrawal, I pulled the symptoms from the DSM, right? And those made up nodes in our network. So you're starting there with labels that already exist. You don't have to, but that's typically what people are doing to even kind of start to think of what should I have in this network. So it is pulling stuff from a traditional approach that might not be, the most desirable thing to do if you're trying to kind of get away from that paradigm altogether. So you don't necessarily have to do that. You could think of approaches about asking people what is it that they think is impacting them the most and capturing fluctuations in those things. In terms of, will it give us kind of greater insight? I hope so, but I think I'm a skeptic until I see the data, and I think as we all are as scientists. And so I see promise in it. It seems like it's telling me something about tobacco withdrawal that I didn't know before I applied this to it, especially kind of the conundrum that once you get back to normal in terms of the your kind of return to homeostasis, now that nicotine isn't in your system, people still experience pretty kind of strange, like residual withdrawal symptoms, like way past the kind of perturbating event. And so I'm wondering if like part of that is because of this residual kind of symptom reverberation to your system. So maybe, but I have a couple of more years to figure that out, I think. Yeah.
That is a question that will keep you busy for a long time, I imagine.
Yeah.
The next question is from Desmond Oates. Why focus only on percent time with emotion and not intensity of emotion?
Good question. So with intensity, so I didn't go through this that kind of clearly in the multi-level model. When you're making these networks, you tend to within person standardize the emotions because there are between person differences in the amount of intensity different people are experiencing. And if you plug those into the model without kind of standardizing them in some way, you end up just capturing you're higher on depression than this person is. And so that will kind of bias the strength of the edges you get out. So you'll end up with like a network that looks like it's all about how my depression is affecting my anxiety, but it's really more about between person differences and just how much of that space you're covering. So that's kind of one reason it was going after time. The other reason is because of reasons to do with just the theory in terms of it's all about like persistence. Like, so the idea that, you know, even high intensity emotions are fine and useful at times, but it's when they persist over time that it becomes problematic. And so that's why I went after that kind of time until it gets back to baseline, which because things are within person centered, it's like how things typically are for you. But I think intensity is really useful. And one thing that's missing from the network approach is that you know, the intensity is essentially gone. One way of thinking, I've been thinking about bringing that back into networks is thinking about annotated graphs where the nodes don't just tell you, okay, this is depression, but it gives you some information about the intensity of that emotion or that symptom for each individual person. And so like Danny Bassett and co have done some really cool stuff on annotated graphs in the context of functional connectivity. And so I'm wondering if that could be a place where we could bring back intensity information into these networks.
Great. Yeah, the annotated graphs are super cool. Next question is from Hannah Howe. Are there any influences of the repeated self-report of mood?
That's a good question. So I'm assuming that you're kind of talking about like reactivity effects, where by asking someone if they're depressed all the time, maybe makes them depressed, right? Like, and surprisingly, there's not like a whole lot on reactivity effects in experience sampling and EMA. There are some examples, and typically what people will do is they'll have like a baseline and follow-up session for one group with no like experience sampling in between, another group with an intense experience sampling protocol with lots of time points, and then one that's less intense, and to see if anything big changes. In the context of tobacco withdrawal, which is kind of the place I'm most familiar with, there's some like some effects on the intensity of withdrawal that people report. It tends to be in the positive direction, so like it doesn't make them worse. It's not huge either, but part of it's explained, we think, because people are kind of becoming more self-aware of themselves, and it helps them understand their symptoms and things like that. But I would love to see more work on that. There's also a really cool video associated with the ISAHEB study. I think I can type this into chat. I'm going to type that into chat so you can find it. But the ISAHEB study, where they videotaped their participants talking about their experience in the study, and they did, you know, lots and lots of momentary reports for many, many months. And there's a video of one person talking about how it made her very aware of her social interactions with her partner. It was always after social interactions with her partner that she would notice that she was like rating things pretty highly, and she ended up breaking up that relationship. So the idea that there aren't reactivity effects, I don't think carries water. I think they're there. I think it's going to be a more like subtle question about who does it matter for what for types of symptoms and things like that. Yeah, great question.
the last question, just to be sensitive to time, we'll give to Ursula Tooley. Ursula asks, I'm super curious about the unbalanced sex distribution in the knowledge network study. Was it attrition and males didn't stick with it? Are there more females on Facebook? Are females more curious? What's going on?
Yeah, so that happened to me. So I ran the study like 2 years ago, and it was just, it wasn't like the attrition, it was the who wanted to sign up for a study. So for some reason, the men didn't, the idea of doing a 21-day daily diary where they also spend like 50 minutes on Wikipedia just wasn't something that, you know, lured them in, I guess, to the study. It could also have to do with the fact that we were recruiting from like mostly Penn and the surrounding Philadelphia community. So I'm not sure of like the distribution of the student body, but presumably like people in psychology and fields like that, which tend to have more women, would have been the ones encountering these advertisements more. And so yeah, that's a good point. I think one of the cool things about taking this intensive repeated measures approach is that you can start to think more about the individual. And so we did that a little bit in the tobacco network world. But going forward, rather than relying on like this idea of like the average person, like the typical kind of public health approach, starting from the bottom up and having a model for each individual, which you can then class into sex or not, if that subgroup kind of naturally emerges. But yeah, that's a long way of saying I don't know, probably to do with where we were recruiting it. But because we're moving more and more to the individual level, I think it's becoming less of a problem.
Awesome. Well, David, you can't hear all the people applauding at home. All six in the audience here. Take a second to write something nice into the chat to thank Dr. Lydon-Staley for that great talk and really cool research. It's great to have you part of MindCORE and here at Penn, man. So glad you still.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me. Cool.
Also, looking forward, there's great MindCORE talks coming up. I'm not sure if anyone from the MindCORE team has anything more to say about that.
Sure. Yes. Next week, we will be joined by new Penn faculty in the psychology department, Michael Arcaro. Same time at noon. And then following that, we'll go back to our regularly scheduled, actually, it's not regular, it's kind of a special series this year where we're inviting people to answer big unanswered questions of the mind. And so I posted the schedule in the chat. And if somebody subscribes right here, if you follow the MindCORE channel on Crowdcast, you'll hear all about those. There are a lot of events that take place at Penn. They're not all on Crowdcast. We try to post things that are happening in the other schools or in other centers or departments that could be of interest to our community. So you can check those out on our website. But thank you both very much. This was truly fascinating work, and I can't wait to see what comes next.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
David, thank you. And thanks for everyone for tuning in. See you next week.
All right. Goodbye, everyone. Thanks, Ted. Thank you, everybody. See you next week.